Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me just turn off the baseball game. Yay, the Orioles are winning. Hooray, Orioles. Sorry, Red Sox fans, but Orioles have been playing like crap lately, so I'm excited to see them play well. Good evening, everybody. Let me take off this Bluetooth headset because it's going to annoy me. And we'll get started. I've got the chat room up, and if anybody has questions, it's great if you can put them in all caps because it makes things just a lot easier for me to kind of tell the questions apart from the chat. Also, frankly, makes it easier to see from across the room. But this is Renaissance Woodworker Live. We're talking about resawing tonight. So we've got a couple of things I'm going to cover on the agenda. First of all, just resawing. Obviously everything I'm doing tonight is resawing by hand, but I'll talk a little bit about just resawing with a regular old handsaw. And it certainly can be done, but the real gist of things is talking about resawing with a dedicated frame saw. This is my 36-inch frame saw. It's got a 3-inch wide blade, but the key to this is it's a 3 points per inch pitched blade. So it's incredibly aggressive. It evacuates sawdust really easily, and it cuts really, really fast. I've got a 48-inch version as well. The blade's not in it right now. It's in my Vise, so it's just touching everything up, touching the teeth up before we get started tonight. So I'm going to focus a little bit on these saws and kind of some of the things I've learned in using them over the last, I think it's been almost 4 years since I made that 48-inch one, and the 36-inch one was a couple months shy of that. I've got the blade almost sharpened over here, so I'll touch a little bit on sharpening the blades. I mean, it's a rip saw, so there's not really anything different. It's just really, really big teeth. And we'll talk a little bit about starting cuts. We'll talk about keeping cuts in line, correcting cuts, and kind of what you can expect in using a frame saw like this. They are super fast, but certainly you put a 36-inch wide board in it, it's going to slow down. But point to me a powered bandsaw that can do a 36-inch wide board that isn't going to take up your entire shop and cost you $12,000. So that's the key to look at tonight is not so much, how fast are these things? I mean, certainly speed is one thing, but if you're doing this by hand, you either are a bit of a zealot like me and want to do everything by hand, or you're in a situation where there's just no way that you could do this with a power tool. The largest board that I've ever resawed on this was just shy of 36 inches wide. It's a piece of walnut, and I resawed the whole thing and ended up making a book match top out of it. I've resawn 22-inch wide, what was that? Red oak or white? I think it was white oak. Wide oak. I've resawn innumerable 12-inch wide boards, and I've resawn a bunch of just typical kind of 6 and 8-inch wide boards. These frame saws just hum through that normal width stuff, and you certainly can make it cut about the same speed as your typical 1 to 1.5 horsepower bandsaw, believe it or not, when you're cutting an 8-inch wide board. But more importantly, the real reason for these saws, in addition to the hand tool zealotry, is there's just times when you just can't do it. A 12-inch wide board is really pushing it on a lot of modern bandsaws. You got to have a really big bandsaw with a really big throat opening in order to get a 12-inch board in there. Your typical 8-inch wide boards sometimes can be really difficult on the average kind of hobbyist bandsaw. I know I had a 14-inch bandsaw with a riser block on it, and there were some tuning issues, don't get me wrong, that needed to be addressed, but it was super slow when I tried to resaw anything above 6 inches wide. And when I'm talking about resawing, we're talking about everything from like splitting a board down the middle. Say maybe you want to open up a board into a book match, and you've got like a 2-inch wide board, and you're sawing it into like 7/8 slices after planing to get yourself a top. Another instance, we're talking about stretching the usage of a board. Maybe it's a really rare species or a highly figured species, and you want to turning it into veneer. Well, that's a whole other thing. Shop sawn veneer, whether it's hand sawn or power sawn, is it's a lot thicker than your commercial stuff. You've got a lot more flexibility to play with it, and you really can stretch out that unusual stock. So there's two different applications, if you will, but it's the same thing. I've cut a 1/8 inch thick veneer with these saws before, and certainly I've cut really thick pieces, just split them in half or split them in thirds and things like that. Again, the operation is pretty much the same. The deal with the frame saws is because they cut so aggressively, when you cut a thinner piece, you've got to be dead certain you're on your line, because obviously the slightest deviation can eat up that 1/8 of an inch thickness really quickly. So we'll spend some time talking about how you work with one of these big saws and how to keep it in line. The biggest misconception I hear with resawing by hand, at least with a big frame saw, is, man, you must be exhausted. Well, when you resaw with one of these, yeah, it's hard work. It's a lot of work. When you resaw with a frame saw, it's almost effortless. In fact, the more effort you put into it, the more chances are that those big aggressive teeth are going to jam up on you. So I rarely does my heart rate raised, and I don't have trouble catching my breath, because it's really all in the legs. You're doing very little arm work. And sometimes I forget myself and I start using my arms, and I'm like, this is stupid, because your arms will get tired. It's pushing a very big saw, and you've got to constantly correct yourself and focus on just using your legs for all the work that comes up. And of course, along the way, we want to talk a little bit, I want to take questions. There's a lot of, misconceptions, a lot of people who are uncertain about this. So right off the bat, first question of the night is the first one I anticipated from Jens. He says, if you could go with one, would you go with a 36 inch or a 48 inch? No question in my mind, it would be the 48 inch saw. That's another thing. A lot of people think, well, 48 inches, that's a 2-man saw, hogwash. You can use this one person, no problem whatsoever. Another thing is that's awful heavy. Well, actually I find the weight of the saw does all the work for you. Just gravity pulling it down into the kerf does a fantastic job of cutting. The 36 inch saw has obviously a lot more capacity to saw a wider board. And you may think, I'm not going to be in a situation where I'm going to be able to even get 36 inch wide boards or 24 inch wide boards, but you're still talking about a lot of teeth. So even if you're sawing, what did I do the other night? I did this is the offcut that I didn't need. Just this skinny little piece of poplar. So yeah, a 4-inch wide piece of poplar. I used my 48 inch saw on this, and I did it in like 15 seconds, something like that, just ridiculous, because you're using that entire saw. You're using all of these teeth. The 36 inch saw, I do find that you have a little bit more control when I'm sawing thin veneers, and that's because of the long throw of the saw. Obviously, with a longer angle like this, the slightest bit of deviation off square is highly exaggerated because I've got such a long axis I'm working with. So with a 36 inch saw, that deviation is less exaggerated, and it's a little bit easier to keep the saw in line. But frankly, with a little bit of practice in these, you kind of overcome that. So the short answer to that question is, I use the 48 inch saw probably 95% of the time, and I use the 36 inch saw a lot of times because I'm feeling guilty. I feel like I should take it down and use it. I've resharpened this blade, God knows, probably 20 times. I've resharpened that blade maybe 4 times. So a 48 inch saw with a 4-inch wide blade, absolutely the way to go. It tracks like it's on rails. If you go with a 36 inch saw, I have a 2-inch wide blade and I've got a 3-inch wide blade in the saw. The wider blades are definitely my preferred tool because they just hold their line a lot better. How thick is the blade kerf on these saws? The kerf is not much wider than the blade itself. There's very little set on this blade, and if I remember correctly, it is it's a 1/16 of an inch wide blade. So it's a beefy blade. I don't know. I worked with Isaac at Blackburn Toolworks when we originally developed these blades years ago, and this was the steel that we could get at the time. I keep meaning to get in touch with Isaac and say, have you played with a thinner plate steel? I don't know. The bad axe saw blade I happen to have one of those here because at some point I'm going to make their version of the saw just to play around with. This is a thinner plate. It's because I'm going to cut a smaller kerf. It's worth doing some experimentation there, but this is a 5 points per inch saw, which is basically, it's actually a little less coarse than this handsaw. And to me, that's what is the secret behind these saws. You guys followed me enough, you know that I'm an enormous fan of Bad Axe Toolworks, but this is one area where I feel like Bad Axe kind of fell short a little bit. It's a great saw, no question. It works well, the ones that I've played with, the demos and things, but this saw is about a pitch thing. Getting this 3 points per inch is really the game changer that makes it saw so fast. If it went with a thinner plate, I don't know that it would really make that big of a difference as far as speeding things up. Certainly your kerf might be a little bit smaller, but being able to saw 1/8 inch thick veneer, you don't really need to go much thinner than that, frankly. You could use construction lumber to build the frame. I wouldn't have a problem with that. I used Poplar on my original frame. I keep thinking I'd like to rebuild it using maple for a little bit heavier saw. The key certainly is to get really straight grain stock that is going to be strong and it's not going to have not have a lot of flex to it. You certainly, I mean, construction grade stuff's going to be a little bit softer, but it's worth a shot. If nothing else, you're not out but, you know, a couple of bucks on some construction grade material. And if it doesn't work, you know, you can just slip the hardware off and go and build it out of a hardwood. I don't really anticipate there being any problems because you've got, by its very nature, the frame has a lot of beam strength built into it. This has tenons that run all the way into the handles here. This is 1.5 by what, 1 3/4 or 2 inch stock. So there's quite a bit of strength in the whole thing. This other saw is made out of Afrormosia. It's an African hardwood, and it's substantially heavier. And in a lot of respects, it does a really good job cutting because it is heavier. But I'm not really worried too much about the specific species that you use because I think the joinery on this is big enough. In this case, I used through dovetail joinery. So again, the joint runs the full length of the handle. It's a super, super strong joinery. Not too worried about there being any problems with failure in the wood. But the cost of this thing lies in the hardware and the blade. You know, you can get as fancy as you want with the lumber. The hardware that I'm using is the stuff that I had developed by Artisan Iron Designs. It's a blacksmith local in my area. We kind of worked up this design and it's frilly and it's fun and I love the leaf detail on top. Certainly it's a lot more ornate and a lot more expensive than some of the stuff that you can find on the market now. Bad Axe has their hardware. It's all the same stuff. It's just a bit of iron tubing that goes over the saw plate and you've got the adjustment screw, and as you slide this down, it pulls the blade apart and pulls it into tension. You've got a plate that is recessed into the top of the saw, so that plate bears against the screw and you're not like tearing up the wood as the screw is tightened. And then the blade itself is held, why did I put the saw down? The blade itself has a couple holes in it and there are bits of U-shaped wire that just go through and clamp it in place. It makes for a lot of flexibility as far as drilling the holes and the positioning of it because you're just going to be tensioning the whole thing up. So you don't have to be nearly that precise when it comes to positioning those holes. The Blackburn Toolworks hardware, this is a lot beefier. It's got a really cool kind of wrought finish to it. I love the eye bolt here. The little OG detail on the bottom looks really, really cool. The hardware in general is just a much higher quality. Even the plate that it rides against, this is the Bad Axe plate, just a little bit of stamped steel. Here's the Blackburn plate with the recessed holes and everything for the screw. It's just super, super beefy. You inlay this into the top. I don't know, I think it's a superior product. Paired with the blades, I think you're going to find that you can't go wrong really with the Blackburn material. And again, like I said, you guys know how much I love Bad Axe, so it hurts me to say that Bad Axe is not the top of their game on that particular one. It's a big step for me, man. All right, let's get into some sawing here. Let's stop talking. So, how do we go about resawing? Well, first things first, if I wanted to take this board, this is, what, 10 inches wide? Sorry, 9 inches wide. And I wanted to just split it in half. Say, in this particular case, it's already a little bit more than an inch thick. This would make some good drawer bottoms or something. I should be able to get 1/2 inch stock out of this. I just measured the center. I actually have a little center finder. I made this on my channel a while ago. It's sometimes called a Spar finder. You just slide it like that, bring the pencil down, and you mark a line bisecting the board. I've run that line all the way around the board. It's on the end grain here, end grain on the other side, and on both faces. So I can very clearly see what I'm doing. There is certainly not a new idea, but you'll find these things called kerfing planes that are on the markets now. They were sometimes called rebate saws in the past. I do not have one. I have friends who have them. I've used them. I've played around with them. I even have a kit from Blackburn Toolworks to make my own one day, but I haven't gotten around to it because I just haven't found them necessary. This is how I start resawing. If I were going to resaw with this handsaw, like I'll show you, I would start with a saw. These blades in the frame saws are so coarse, they are a royal pain in the you-know-what to start. It's certainly possible, but it's just not worth the effort to sit around trying to get those massive teeth to start. What I do is start just with a normal handsaw. It's a lot harder with a long blade like this, but it comes down to taking the weight off the saw. So as you're holding the saw, there's this lower horn down here. You want to really feel that horn pressing into the palm of your hand, and what that's doing is taking the weight off the toe. The more weight that comes off of it, the easier it's going to be to get the thing started. Let me just bring this in a little bit closer because I want you guys to see that line across the top. You should be able to see that. This is essentially a great big giant tenon cut. I really want to work that line across the top. And if you see my fingers here, I've got this thumb out of the way of the tooth line. Don't put it down by the tooth line, you cut yourself. The thumb is kind of acting like training wheels. It's not really applying a lot of pressure, but it's guiding the saw as I come across the end grain. Just kind of suggesting that it stay on my line. So there's that line across the top. And just go ahead and deepen it a little bit. It doesn't have to be super deep. And that is what I would do to start either of those frame saws with just that amount of cut. The kerfing plane is a plane that, you know, it's got an integral fence and you can run it all the way around the board and set up a kerf all the way around the board. If you do a lot of resawing with a blade like this, now again, this is a bit coarser. This is actually a 4 points per inch tooth with a progressive 5 points per inch here at the toe. If you were using the Bad Axe blade, which is 5 points per inch, similar to a lot of your typical coarse rip saws. I've got another one over here. Disney Todd says, do you use winding sticks on your blade? I do not. I saw someone mention that earlier in the chat room. I've played around with that. The reason I don't when using the frame saw is because the wide beam of the saw is a winding stick. You think about it. A winding stick exaggerates twist. The toolbox is in the way. You know, if you've got a board that's this wide, can be hard to see the twist. So you add a winding stick, which basically widens that board and exaggerates the twist. Well, when your saw, why did I leave the saw all the way over there? When your saw is shoulder height, it's about as long as my winding stick. So the only way to beat that is get a longer winding stick. So the frame saw really acts as a winding stick. I don't really find the need to do that. I suppose you could use a winding stick in a case where you've got a narrow blade, but then how are you going to do that? So here is a 5 points per inch saw. It's the same pitch as the bad axe saw. Here's an instance where the blade is fine enough that having that starter kerf will really go a long way to guiding the saw, keeping the saw kind of following the path of least resistance. I find with the 3 points per inch blades, the path of least resistance, it's whatever gets in its way, and it can still deviate from that kerf. If you're just relying upon that kerf to keep it in line, it won't really stick to it as much because the saw is so coarse and it's just pulling out huge amounts of wood all at the same time. The slightest deviation will cause it to go off your line. So that is yet another reason why I just really didn't get into the habit of using a kerfing plane. It's not to say it's necessarily a bad idea, but I just don't know that it's absolutely necessary to resaw. I would, if I was going to resaw this board with a typical handsaw, this is it. I mean, I like to set the board up a little bit higher so I can drop the handle down and kind of come at it at an angle. I can take a nice wide stance, really line up my sawing shoulder with the kerf and go to town. This is hard work. This will take a long time. I would definitely not want to saw a 9-inch wide board with a typical handsaw like this. Maybe the 4 points per inch one would be, this is going to be a little bit more aggressive. This is going to do a little bit better job, a little bit faster. But you'd be amazed how, not amazed, you probably won't be amazed just at how exhausting that will become really quickly. Now, anytime you're resawing, it's always a good idea to flip the board periodically. To check that you're on your line on the opposite face. And if you are drifting, you can try to correct it a little bit, bring it back in line. I went a little bit wide on my line there, so I'm just gonna kind of tweak the wrist a little, steer it back in, and correct that cut. The other little thing about stopping and flipping it around like that is it rests your arm while you take time to turn the thing around. It's exhausting work. But again, we're talking about a 9-inch wide board. If I were resawing this 4-inch wide board, say I'm making drawer sides, which is what I was doing with this, it's not bad. It's really not bad work. You really don't want to use anything finer than a 5 points per inch saw though. It's just exhausting work. It's just not efficient. You wouldn't want to do that. So and let me just, I'm not going to finish this with this saw because it's just ludicrous when I have the other ones. But the process would be to keep working down, flipping the board. I flip the board maybe, once a minute or something like that. And I'll keep working down towards my leg vise. As it starts to get close, I'll take the board out and flip it in for end and repeat the entire process, making that starting kerf on top and then working my way down to the point where your saw cut, ideally, will meet in the middle. And if you get it right, you will have the board just kind of magically pop apart. And generally you end up with a line. It's really hard to see that in this light. There we go. See that line right there? That's where the saw cuts met. And nice clean line, the board just popped right apart, and I was back to work. Doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you have problems. Sometimes when you flip in for end, you went to the other side, the cuts don't quite line up, and you end up with something a little bit more noticeable, like this. I've actually got a bit of a flap sticking up here. I've had a lot worse where you've actually missed it entirely. And generally, when you get to that point, you just can't figure out where your connective tissue still is. And this is where the kerfing plane, I find, really is a disadvantage, because the kerfing plane has created a kerf all the way around the board. If you skip the kerf, as I started this cut. And I've got the kerf down the board here. I didn't make a starter kerf along this long edge. As I come near the middle of the board and it's not coming apart, I can very clearly see where I haven't cut yet. I can flip it over and I can see where I haven't cut that there. With the starter kerf from the kerfing plane, it disguises that and sometimes can be a little difficult. But you'll also get to a point where it's close enough on the inside of the cut that, let's just imagine these were together. It's close enough that it's kind of like wiggling a little bit. You can feel it, like you can pull down here and it comes apart, and you can pull down here and it rocks apart. In that case, take yourself a wedge, or if you have a fro, and just slide it in there and pop the thing apart. And you may end up with a little bit of splitting or a weird flap in the middle. But again, if you've got a thick enough board, if you've allowed for some allowance in there, you should be okay. Ideally, this is what we're going for. And this was sawn with the 48-inch 3 points per inch saw. And if you look at that, see if I can catch it in the light right, it's a really good surface. I haven't planed this surface at all. That's a very nice, essentially bandsawn surface that with just a little bit of planing, I can clean that up. So I'm not having to get a board that's dramatically thicker in order to pull this off. I'm able to, with a typical 4/4 board, this was a 4/4 board here, 4/4 piece of poplar. What I've got left is, I was shooting for 3/8 of an inch drawer sides. I have 9/16. This is a 9/16 thickness board. So the drawer side that came out of it, well, it's down there, it's already milled up. But it was just a little bit fatter than the 3/8 that I needed. I planed it down with a couple of passes and it was ready to go. So a typical 4/4 board, I'm able to split it in half and get, 1/2 inch drawer stock or 1/2 inch drawer bottom stock or something like that. There's really not a lot of waste going on in here when you use one of these resaws. Okay, what I want to do, because I want to pull out the frame saw and start using it a little bit. Sharpening is, there's nothing to it really. These are all filed rip. They are, so there's no fleam at all. They're set up to be as aggressive as you can make it. 0 degrees rake, 0 degrees fleam. I suppose you could add a little bit of rake to the tooth if you wanted. I don't know that that's really necessary. Because again, the more aggressive this is, the better it's going to cut. This saw vise I built myself. I've got a video on my site or here on my channel that just goes into it. It's literally just 2 blocks, 2 boards, a hinge on the bottom, some spacer blocks made out of white oak in the middle, and I've lined the jaws with leather. And I just clamp it in my leg vise. In this case, I'm using my sliding leg vise, and it holds it beautifully. And I can hold a 40-inch blade on it. So I do have to adjust the position of my 48-inch blade. The file is a monster. Huge 11-inch long nickels and tapered file. I had to find these on eBay. I just checked the other day. They're still there. I'll provide links to all this stuff, and then I just created a handle. This actually was my my New Concepts fret saw handle when I originally bought it. So, I mean, literally, I just set myself up, square my shoulders, and this saw has been jointed recently. The shaping is all done, so literally I'm just coming back and touching up the teeth. Got a little bit more flex in the blade than I want right now. I think my jaws may have warped a little. I won't lie, it is tiring to sharpen these blades because there's so many dang teeth. That's why I did most of it before I turned on the camera. That finishes that up, and it's got that nice sticky sharp feel to it. So sharpening, you could use a regular saw vise, but I just find because these blades are so long, they really benefit from having a longer jaw like this. But the sharpening process is actually a really good saw to learn to sharpen on because these teeth are just so freaking big. I mean, you saw as I position the file across, it just drops down in there and it won't move at all. Smaller teeth certainly can be a little bit more cumbersome or a little bit more troublesome if you don't have the experience, but with a big tooth like this, it's really, it's kind of idiot proof. So where's my blade? Oh. Pick up the frame here. And top of it is there. Again, the holes that I've drilled on here are actually 3/8 of an inch holes. They're a little bit smaller on the other end. When I originally drilled the holes on this saw, I drilled them to be just slightly larger than the wire itself. And then I just realized that's kind of silly. That actually makes it harder to position everything and get it in place if I've got to really thread the wire through. And considering how, you know, I'm doing this all wrong, considering how cumbersome this big giant frame is anyway, it's just easier to go ahead and get it with a bigger hole that you don't have to fiddle around with. Where's my other wire? Oh no. There it is. Don't knock these on the floor. Come on. There we go. Make sure the tension's removed from the other side. Makes it a little bit hard. There we go. Now we're in place. I'll kind of drop this down, and I just want to verify that my hardware hasn't shifted, that I'm in the center. There's not really a lot of science to this, that, you know, once you apply tension here, it quickly kind of pulls everything up snug. It also really tightens up the entire frame. As far as tensioning this goes, I can hear a little bit of rattle in the blade. Going for, there we go, a good tone without a lot of rattle. A nice B flat is good. Just kidding, it's not a B flat. Come on, it's an A flat. All right. Let's do some sawing. Any questions while I'm setting this thing up? Yeah, it's certainly easier to lock it in a vise, but you know. This is live, people. You're just lucky that I'm making any sense whatsoever. How long does it take to sharpen that blade? That 48-inch blade, I pulled that out of the frame saw about 30 minutes before I went live today, and got, in maybe 10 minutes, I got through what you saw, and then obviously you saw how long I took to do the last like quarter of the blade. Not really that long. I mean, when it's already sharpened and you're just kind of going back and do a quick once over of the teeth, it's really not that big of a deal. You can buy those blades from Blackburn already sharpened and set, or you can buy them for a little bit cheaper without any of that work done. And the teeth are just punched out. And really the geometry is already set there. So there's really not a lot of shaping going on. There's really not even any need to joint it when you first get the blade, although it's, you know, it's worth it just to add a little bit of flat to the top of the teeth to help you gauge your progress as you're sharpening. At the outside, 20 minutes maybe to sharpen the whole thing from stem to stern. The setting can be a little bit more time consuming because they're big teeth and your average saw set doesn't really have the oomph to handle it, but you also don't want to put a lot of set into it because the plate is already big enough as it is. You start adding a huge amount of set and you'll just end up with problems. So I don't set it at all. When I first got it, it didn't set it at all, and I went to work and gauged how it was running, and if it was pulling one way or the other, I would set some teeth into the direction it was pulling to kind of steer it back in. Another method to do that is to go ahead and add a little bit of set to every tooth. So you at least know that every tooth is set evenly, so ideally it should run true. If it's not running true, then you've got a little bit more control over which way to turn it or not. Right now, I haven't had to reset these teeth. I haven't sharpened it enough that I really needed to reset it. If I did, when I do come time to reset it, I will go ahead and follow that methodology and set every tooth just a little bit. It just gives me a little bit more control over things. The reason that I don't use the Gramercy saw vise there is just because the Gramercy saw vise is so much shorter, and it would just require to move the saw a lot more. I just find this one holds one of these 36-inch blades without moving it, and you get into a rhythm and you can crank through it really, really quickly there. So I specifically wanted to get the 48-inch one up and running again to show you that it's not a two-man operation. The most difficult part of this is just getting it up and holding it. So I'll set the handles, whatever these things are called, kind of under my forearms, and you just kind of cantilever it out, drop it in the kerf because the kerf is already established. Drop it in there. It balances and holds quite nicely. The problem here on this particular instance is the board is actually sitting on my leg vise screw right now, so I can't drop it down anymore. If I move it one side of the screw or another, I can drop it down more, but you really need to bring a second clamp to bear. There's a huge amount of force that this saw will create, and there's every possibility that it will actually just start to shift in the vise. I could probably, with that leg vise, crank down enough to hold it, but just a secondary clamp across the bench will help a lot there too. The other thing is if your bench is particularly flimsy and it skates across the floor, this saw will push it across the floor. So it's something to think about, finding a way to maybe anchor the bench or weigh the bench down if you're going to do a lot of work here. Now, here's the key. When you first, now this, as you just saw, this was just sharpened. So any blade that's been freshly sharpened is going to be a little bit sticky at first. So let's just see as I step forward. No, it's nice and smooth. But if you notice, I actually don't like sawing on this side. I prefer to saw on the other side of the bench. I don't have room to set up a camera and do all that. The reason for that, I suppose I could use my leg vise, but with my hip up against the bench, I'm not actually aligned with the saw plate at this point. I'm a little bit off to one side. So I end up having to kind of tweak things a little bit. What I want to be doing is kind of keeping my sawing hands, these two hands down here, kind of keeping them in my peripheral vision, sighting down the blade and then sighting down my cut line, my pencil line, and lining everything up. And some of that can be twists, some of that can be side-to-side motion, really paying attention to that. And in this case, with my left hip against the bench, I'll step back with my left foot, and it kind of turns my body a little bit. It allows me to line everything up. This saw, as I mentioned earlier, because it's so long, the slightest deviation, if I move just a fraction of an inch one side, it really exaggerates that angle and I can go off my line real quick. So you really want to focus on keeping it aligned. And oftentimes, if you see video of me sawing with this, I usually have this very serious look on my face because I'm like focusing on multiple planes all at the same time. But if you'll notice, my shoulders, I'm not pushing. I'm keeping it kind of shoulder height, and I'm just stepping forward and stepping back. And you'll find that you can steer. If the cut starts to angle one way or another, I can twist the blade a little and do some steering with it. Especially once I've just sharpened it and I've got a little bit of burr, because I sharpened all the way across on one side. I'll end up with a little bit of burr on one side. I can come back and stone that off, but it usually comes off pretty quickly just in using the saw. So a lot of times I have to kind of angle the cut a little until it starts sawing true again. But if you first get this saw and you're like, it's stuck, it won't work. If I plant my feet and just try to push, it's a lot of work. But if you keep your arms relaxed at your side and just step forward, I mean, there's just no effort required. Obviously, I'm standing here sawing, running off at the mouth, and we've gone about 9 inches into this board. Let's flip it around and see how we're holding onto our line. So there is the far side of the cut. There's my line. I'm on my line. Here's the other side of the cut. I'm on my line. So really, really accurate. You know what? Blog das Madeiras. I have not named my frame saws. I need to remedy that. I should really have names for my frame saws. Anybody have name suggestions for my frame saws? And Bodie McBoatface is not acceptable. It's like I need to run a competition to name the frame saws. We've got the 36 inch and the 48 inch. Pick your favorite name. All right, now, I don't know if you guys saw that, but I just kind of grabbed it and went to work and didn't take the time to line everything up, and it tweaked a little bit and I went off my line. I know, I just pulled the thing out. Let me switch cameras real quick and I'll show you. So, lost focus a little bit. See that? It's a little hard to see. There's my line and I just skewed back across it with what? Those 3 or 4 strokes. I went right off my line because I didn't take the time to reset and refocus. So it's not the end of the world. As quickly as you can go off your line by not paying attention to your alignment, you can angle the saw, again, tweaking it a little bit. 3 strokes, 4 strokes, and I'm back. Now the line, and you see there's a little bit of a curve right there. There's the belly of the curve, and it's back on my line. Meanwhile, still on my line over here. So all is good. And where did Mighty Casey strike it? Not Whoville. All right. This saw is so much fun to use. That's all I can say. It's just a blast. I want to keep that on my line just to make sure that that slight bow hasn't like deviated the saw as I work my way through it. So I'm going to keep twisting a little bit. Okay, I should be through that. Feel good about that. And we are halfway through the board. So this is what, 30 inches? 32 inches long. We've done 16 inches of the cut and however long that time was. So I'm going to flip this end for end just to show you the full process of starting the kerf. Since we started it with this saw originally, I'm going to go back and do the same thing again. Come on, take the weight off the saw, there we go. tough angle to saw at right now. Take some time to align my body, it'll saw better. Okay, there's the starter curve. Now, one other thing, and I hate to say this because I don't know if you're listening, Mark Harrell. If you are, you know I love you, buddy. But when it comes to kerfing planes, I would go Blackburn Toolworks as well. Or I would get the Bad Axe version and I would alter the geometry of the blade. I would make the gullet bigger. Isaac has added a rounded gullet, which clears sawdust like crazy. The thing with a kerfing plane is you're essentially asking every tooth to contact. It's like a dado saw or a stair saw. You're using it parallel to the wood. You're not using it at an angle. So all of these teeth are making contact and they're picking up sawdust and it clogs really, really easy, really, really quickly. So Isaac has done it so that he's got big rounded gullets and there's a lot more room for the sawdust to be excavated to, and it cuts a lot more efficiently. In playing with the Bad Axe version, I just found it to be so slow. A hell of a lot slower than what we just did with that saw. Okay, so now we set the kerf with this saw. More than likely, the kerf is a little bit different. It's not set the same, it's a different plate thickness, all that fun stuff. So we might have a little bit more difficulty getting this all started now. Again, lining everything up, just taking a step forward. No, that was pretty easy. These first probably 10 saw strokes are super important. You really want to stay hyper focused on your line. I am laser focused on the line and sighting right down the plate here and making thousands of tiny little side to side and angular adjustments to steer that saw and keep it on the line. Once you get really buried in the cut, you'll find that it's a lot harder to deviate, obviously, because you've got so much plate, and that's why this wide 4-inch plate is so awesome as compared to the 2-inch. I've got a 48-inch 2-inch blade as well, and that was like the first maybe 5 or 6 months in using this saw. Went to the 4-inch blade and it was a total game changer. Okay, now that I'm well into the cut, let me check my other face. I'll go ahead and flip it. Again, just to even anything out. If there's any inconsistency in the kerf, I can even it out by changing sides like this. Did I miss any questions here? Salco is saying I was going to buy my first blade from Bad Axe. Again, please don't misunderstand me. It's a great saw. It's an absolutely great saw. I just don't think it's the right geometry. It's not the right pitch for this operation. If all you're going to do is saw 4-inch wide boards like drawer fronts. This is these drawer fronts are veneered faces. See, I've got a mahogany veneer over front of actually a cherry substrate, and that is 1/8-inch mahogany veneer. And the drawer front is what, 2.5, 2 3/4 wide. A 5 points per inch saw would do a great job, and a 5 points per inch frame saw would do an even better job than a handsaw. Again, because of the different mechanics. Because instead of holding with one hand and tiring out one hand and having to angle your body, you essentially can square your shoulders off. And this is why the footwork is so effective. Because I can just square everything off and go to town. I'm using both hands evenly. I'm tweaking it a little bit right now to make sure that I'm on my line. It's wanting, on my side, away from the camera, it's wanting to walk a little bit to the left. So I'm just, see that twist there? Just manipulating it a little bit. Just steer it onto that line. And there we go. It's a totally different body mechanics now. And it makes it so much easier. And the whole winding stick thing is just not necessary because we've got winding sticks. I mean, seriously. It's the same length as my winding stick, so there's really no reason to put a winding stick out there that doesn't do me any good. Somebody asked if I ever saw from the other side of the bench. You might have come in a little bit later. I actually prefer to saw from the other side of the bench, so I don't have to have my hip pressed up against the bench. It's much easier to stand off the bench like this and really line up on the kerf and step that way. There's just no room with the camera and everything too close to the wall. I specifically chose a wider than usual board here, just so that we can really see how well this thing cuts. You know, I could stick a 4-inch board up there and be done in, you know, less than a minute. But I think the true game-changing nature of this saw is being able to resaw wider boards. Probably a lot of you in the chat room that have a bandsaw, and you could probably use that bandsaw to easily saw a 4-inch or 5-inch wide board. But a 9, 10-inch wide board, that poses a little bit more difficulty. At this rate, I'm probably doing about a linear inch, maybe every 15 to 20 seconds or so. So to go through, whoops, a 32-inch board, somebody do the math. An inch per quarter, 32 divided by 4 is what, 8 minutes? 8 minutes to resaw this board. That's a lot of sawing, don't get me wrong. 8 minutes of continuous sawing, my heart rate is up a little bit because I've been sawing constantly. So certainly, it's not totally effortless. My arms aren't tired in the slightest. It's just my little jazzercise routine, my step class. Whoops, see what I did there? I didn't step and I pushed with my arms and the whole thing jammed up on me. I'm losing focus. I'm focusing on talking and not sawing. Realign, step forward. And I'm not even really moving my feet. I'm just kind of rocking my body back. You can't really see it in the camera angle, but this foot here is just kind of coming off the ground and then falling back down. It's just this rocking motion. One thing is that hold fast is digging into my hip right now. Oh, so much better. I should probably switch sides, but I may be tracking okay, but it would be a good idea to switch sides anyway. Got a little tiny bit of deviation, not really, maybe 30-second of deviation away from the line on this side. So let me tweak the saw a little bit and pull it back in line. Another thing that works really well, you'll see that this board is vertical, straight up and down. So I'm sawing directly across the grain. That is the most aggressive attack angle, presentation angle for a rip saw, essentially 90 degrees across the grain. But a lot of us probably know that the optimal ripping angle is about 60 degrees. So if I were to angle this board a little bit, technically, I should be even a little bit more efficient at removing sawdust. It also is a little less vibration because I'm not cutting right into the end grain. I'm going to go back to the other end here. This is how much is remaining. That is 4 inches or so. And already I've got a little bit of rock there where I've created kind of an internal hinge. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. So on the other side, I got that. Again, the length I recommend is 48 inches. You know what? Sorry guys, let me pull out the 36 inch just because I haven't used it at all. This was the first question of the night. What length do I recommend, 36 or 48? As you can see, I'm very easily handling the 48 inch blade. It's just more teeth. It just cuts so much better. If all you do is veneer work, then I suppose this saw would work fine for you. Bigger's better, man. Mike, hey Mike, how are you? If resawing drawer sides, would you want to use 28 plus for 4 sides or 14 plus for 2 sides? I'm not sure what your question is there, Mike. 28 plus, 14 plus. Can you rephrase that? I'm not sure I know what you mean. I'm still getting audio output on this side, guys, so we should be fine. Yep, it's all good here. All right, I'm gonna go back to the 36 inch blade. This just feels so dinky now. You know what this saw needs? Wax. This saw has little to no set on it right now, and I'm wondering if I should go back and add a little bit more. Here's the other thing. If I were to remake the saw, I made it proportionally to have, kind of the appropriate width for the length. I think I would make it wider, because it's a lot narrower, and in my instance, it's actually narrower than my shoulders are broad. So I find that I'm kind of like, I feel constricted, especially after using that guy. And it's, I'm using more of my arm muscles to use it. So if you do go with the 36-inch blade, think about making this handle at least as wide as your shoulder width. So keep it about, in my case, this wide, which is about as wide as that. It's actually a little bit wider, which I kind of like that feel of being out a little bit more. See, this one, the whole thing feels less efficient to me because it's just a much shorter stroke, and I can't really use the full kind of length of a saw stroke with it because I'm running out of blade. And it could be that I obviously have a strong bias towards this saw. I'm always going to like this bigger saw more. Such is life. No, I'll keep it on this side. Resawing should be doing whatever is most efficient, and there's no question in my mind. That's better. This is more efficient. All right. I'm really angling this now because my cut from the other side has deviated a little bit more than I wanted it to. Not that much, but enough that I want to make sure that I don't past my other saw kerf. I want to at least meet the other saw kerf. This is where it gets a little hairy too, as the leg vise starts to compress the lower kerf, can cause some problems. Where's that piece of cherry that I had earlier? There we go. So one thing that's really helpful is a wedge. I want to flip it one last time. There it was. Did you feel the saw, or feel the, did you guys feel that? Did you feel the saw? Did you hear it kind of jump a little? And it kind of bumped and slotted into place. Now this is not going to be a perfect resaw. Yeah, there's a little bit of connecting tissue in here, but only that much. So, get the shadows right here. There is a little bit of, man, there we go. See that little V shape there? Just that little ledge where my saw cut deviated right near the end. That's just called not paying attention like I should. But let's grab straight edge. And you can see there's no barrel to that cut. That is a great cut. It's just that little deviation right there. If I check the thickness, I'm at 5/8 of an inch. I'm at like 5/8 plus maybe a 32nd on this edge. Let me just double check down here. I'm a little heavy of 5/8, but not a full 32nd. On this end, a little heavy of 5/8, maybe a 32nd, and dead on at 5/8 there. So that's a super good resaw, nice and even. The other thing is because I'm skipping the, oh, and here, from the other side, that obviously looks a lot worse. You can see the part where it's split right there. That is the other side of this little ledge. So what this means is I'd probably grab like a scrub plane and just kind of traverse across the grain, pull that out real quick, and I'd be nice and level from there on out. Just for fun. I was supposed to split this. I don't know how accurate my measurement was. I'm at 11/16, so I'm a 16th heavy of 5/8. Same there. And down here I should be a little less than that. I'm about a 32nd heavy of 5/8 here. A little bit more than 32nd here, so it's not quite even across. But for the most part, I've got two equal width boards. Boy, I make a lot of sawdust too. That would fold out to make a book match. I could glue it together to make a very nice, in this case, it's thin enough that I would use like a drawer bottom or something. With the 5/8 or slightly heavier than 5/8, there's no reason why I couldn't dimension this down to a 1/2 inch, especially considering how flat it is right now. I could easily get a 1/2 inch thick panel, make great drawer bottoms or door panels or something like that. Very little cleanup required after that too. Oh, question, do I ever saw on the other board side, the long board side? No. I suppose I could. So instead of sawing, you know, in this aspect, I'd put it this way and saw on the long side. What you're doing is just asking for more of the teeth to be engaged. With a 48-inch blade and a 32-inch cut like this, I've cut a 32-inch wide board, but it's a lot slower because you can imagine, let's look at this in profile here. You can imagine I can only engage like so much of the saw plate at once. And it's not so much that I'm using so many teeth, but there's only so much space for the teeth to excavate their sawdust. And on a 32-inch wide board, the teeth in the middle of the blade, they never leave the kerf. So there's always sawdust packed in there, and you're hoping that it's transporting it out and it's dumping out the side, but inevitably you constantly have to pull the saw out and kind of remove the sawdust, and it's a lot slower. So in this particular case, it just wouldn't make sense to do that. Technically though, you'll get kind of big, kind of weird stringy shavings when you do saw that way. I suppose for the right size board, I would do that, but it just, again, the optimal angle of a rip saw is 60 degrees across the grain like this. So if I'm sawing this way, that's why I'm getting longer, kind of soft, fluffier shavings almost, because I'm working like a plane instead of a chisel across the blade. So it just, it would be a lot less efficient to saw it that way. Yes, I would just hand plane this flat afterwards. It doesn't take much time at all. And in order to answer that question, how much hand planing would it take to make it flat? I mean, it all depends upon how accurate your cut is. I mean, if there's a massive deviation in the cut, but even then, it's just a matter of focusing on where that deviation is, analyzing where that high spot is, and hitting that. So in this particular instance, here, let me get closer. In this instance, I've got a pretty flat board, right? I've got this little deviation here. So as I grab my straight edge, I'm flat across the width. I've got a little bump right there, but I'm still flat across the width. So as we check the length, there's definitely the high spot right there. Okay, no big deal. So let's grab a 4-plane and just focus on that high spot right here. I knew that was going to happen. Wasn't planning there, was I? Let's pull that up. There we go. That was dumb. That was really dumb. All right. Suppose you could even be more efficient and traverse this. Anybody in my hand tool school is tired of hearing me say this, but I'm all about spot planing. Not trying to tackle the entire board at once, but just focusing on those specific high spots. And now I'm flat. The high spot is gone. I'm flat across the width. At this point, the board's flat enough that I would put the scrub plane away, or not the 4-plane, you know what I mean, the heavy duty plane. And I would go, for this length of board, I would go to a joiner plane and flatten it out from there. Give me, you know, maybe another minute or so of work and the thing would be flat and ready to go. But, caveat emptor. Resawing is stressful on the board. I have released the gooey cream center of this particular Twinkie has now been laid bare. And there's a lot of moisture that's now dumping out of here. And in this case, this board, as you can see, just the oxidization color there, this board is well acclimated. It's dumped all its moisture, so I've got uneven moisture exchange here, and there's every possibility that the board is going to cup on me because there is so much free moisture coming out of this. At the same time, I have released any bound up tension in the board, any internal tension based on how the tree grew, interlocking fibers, things like that. By the way, this is basswood, so it's really stable stuff. It's really mellow wood. So any internal tensions in there may cause twisting or warping. So what I would do, anytime, like if I'm doing drawer bottoms or whatever, I would do my resawing on my drawer bottoms like right out of the gates before I did any other work. I'd resaw them, grab some stickers. In fact, I've got this going on this side of the shop already. I've got some drawer bottoms over here. I would take some stickers. Stickers are just random scraps of wood. Sticker the boards. And what this does is allow for flow of air between the boards. It's separating them out and allowing air to run between them. And then I actually take some clamps and I clamp across the sticker. And what that's doing right in the middle, it's flattening them out along the sticker. Now you obviously want your stickers to be flat or relatively flat. We're not talking precision flatness here. But what this is doing is just suggesting that these boards stay flat. The resawn face is facing in here. I sliced it right down the middle, and I'm just clamping together, holding any cup as the boards dump their moisture and start to come into equilibrium moisture content. That doesn't mean that these clamps are going to prevent cupping altogether, but they will help a lot. They'll prevent a lot of the major cupping that can come from just letting it sit unrestrained. If you were to just like take a board, especially the thinner you slice it, just kind of leave it there on the bench with nothing holding it in place, there's every possibility it's going to cup on me. So the point of that is I wouldn't do a whole lot of planing right now, especially a board this wide. At 9 inches wide, there could be significant movement here. On this guy, at 4 inches, actually a little under 4 inches wide, it's going to be very little movement. Plus, this is also a quarter sawn board, so the movement is not going to be the same as a flat sawn board. It's going to be much, much less. I just went right to work. This was the drawer side. I resawed them and went right on to work. But I resawed my bottoms first, then resawed my sides, did all the milling for my sides. I'm going to go ahead and do all the joinery, all the dovetail work, assemble my drawer box. And at the rate that I work, with a full-time job and everything, a week could go by, 2 weeks could go by the time I have a drawer box. Then my drawer bottom panels have been sitting there acclimating the whole time, stickered and clamped. So when I pull them out of those clamps, they've equalized now, and they're going to be much more stable. Then I can come in and plane them. But again, the cut quality of this board is just, it's really nice. Just because it's a coarse pitch saw doesn't mean you're getting like, a rough sawn surface, although that's a good question. Let me grab a rough sawn board. Well, here's another big 16-quarter block of basswood. Let's get close with the camera here. So here's a rough sawn face of basswood. This was rough sawn from the mill. A little bit splintery, not too bad. Here is the bandsaw frame sawed face. It's cleaner than your sawmill surface. It's not massively cleaner, so you can expect it to feel kind of like rough sawn lumber, but probably rough sawn lumber that's had 180 grit sandpaper run over it and kind of knock down the stray splinters, and that's what's left. If your board is massively out of flat, when you start, there's every possibility you'll have a massively out of flat resaw. If that's the case and your board is already out of flat, you would probably want to go ahead and maybe flatten one face. And then as you're marking your line, your pencil line around, you'll be referencing off that flat face. I usually just go right off the rough sawn face because I'm planning for enough thickness on my boards that, hey, if I need to remove 1/8 of an inch while I'm planing, from both faces, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So certainly, you've got to allow for movement. You've got to allow for the fact that, there's a kerf there. The saw could deviate in the kerf. You may have to do a little bit of steering, and you'll end up with, you know, a little bit gnarlier kind of flap in here where the board deviated. Actually, I can pull that flap off pretty easily. And you know, in that particular case, I may lose a little bit more thickness here, but knowing that I'm already thick enough that I could plane 1/8 of an inch, maybe even more off of this and get to my finished thickness, I'll be fine. Plus, who's to say my finished thickness has to be 1/2 an inch? In this case, I'm shooting for 1/2 an inch. If I come in at 7/16, it's not the end of the world. Who cares, right? Who cares if I'm a 16th or a 32nd shy or 1/8 of an inch shy? A 7/16 inch drawer bottom or a 3/8 inch thick drawer bottom on a typical case drawer is not going to be super, super weak. I don't know whether I would necessarily go all the way down to a 1/4 inch. Maybe, depends on the wood species. But there's no saying that it has to be 1/2 an inch. The limiting factor there is the groove that you cut in your drawer side. So yeah, if all you have is a 1/2 inch plow plane blade, then maybe you either grind down another plow plane blade to get to a smaller one, or you use a chisel to cut it out, or you use a saw, saw out the extent of your groove so that you can make it whatever width you want and just kind of chisel out the stuff in between. That's I don't want to make this a hand tool, power tool thing, but I'm about to say that's a power tool way of thinking. You've got to set, you know, it's got to be this thickness because that's what my power tools allow. Hand tools allow us the freedom to make the joint or whatever size we want. So in the process of milling, if you find out you're going to be scant a little bit thinner, it's no big deal. You just adjust on the fly from there. Yeah, Disney Todd, I love that name. It's giving me the motivation I need to finish my bad axe frame saw. Hey, that's awesome. I say this a lot, sorry guys, that the, what am I doing here? Oh, my camera's turned. That this frame saw has kind of changed everything I do with woodworking. It's changed the way I work because it allows me to buy wider lumber that I normally wouldn't touch because, you know, how am I going to resaw that? What am I actually going to do with a board that's that wide? I really don't have any limitations anymore. I'm able to slice up thick boards if I find them. I'm able to resaw and get great color and grain matches from thicker boards. It's really changed the way I woodwork and given me a lot more control over the design statement that I go for by using that frame saw. Mike says, is it possible to resaw a thicker board into 3 or more is to the limit? You can saw it however you want. When we're talking about veneer, in fact, where'd it go? This 16-quarter piece of basswood, this is the original board that the boards that I just cut came out of this. It's a cross cut. So this big, thick 4-inch wide board used to be a heck of a lot longer. It actually used to be 8 feet long. The rest of it's out in my lumber shed. I cross cut it in a more manageable length because that's the other thing. If you don't have to make a resaw 6 foot long, if your part only needs to be 30 inches long, cross cut it, make it shorter. If I were making a drawer side here, this would be, you know, a 32-inch wide drawer, which is a hell of a wide drawer. There's no reason for that. I would cross cut it down to something shorter. So in this particular case, this board has been, I've got another piece somewhere around here. I think it's over there. I've got 3 slices and the rest of it is floating around the shop somewhere. I still have an inch and a quarter somewhere floating around the shop. I don't know, maybe it's out in my shed, but I've got 4 slices out of this 16-quarter board. Obviously it's 4 inches thick. I'm able to pull some 4-inch thick boards out of it. I could slice that into 1/8-inch veneers and really stretch out the thickness. There's no limit. You can bisect the board, you can trisect it, quadsect it, or, you know, slice out little tiny veneers. Obviously, the thinner you saw your board, the more that board is going to potentially cup and move around on you because there's just less, call it beam strength, if you will. There's more chance of it potato chipping on you because it's super thin. Also, the thinner it is, though, the easier it is for you to just kind of flatten it back out. If you're slicing 1/8-inch veneer, it's gonna cup on you. There's no way around it. But you're probably gonna glue it down and stick it in a veneer press or vacuum bag or something like that. If you're using hide glue or something and painting both faces of that veneer, it's gonna even things out. So yeah, there's really no limit. I would say I could probably go thinner than 1/8 of an inch. I just haven't tried because I don't really want to. An eighth of an inch gives me lots of material to work with, gives me room to tooth one side, really play around with it, plane it, get it super smooth, and not worry about blowing through that veneer. I'm sure I could pull 3/32, maybe even a 16th of an inch. The problem with the 16th of an inch is it's just so flexible on one side of the cut that I would worry that the slightest little misstep would cause it to blow out and give me problems. So it's just not worth really playing around with that. One thing I do want to say, when to resharpen the saw, what to look for. You know what? Dang, I should have thought of that. When to resharpen the saw was last night. I was doing some resawing. Those drawer boards that are clamped up over on the top of my planer over there, I was resawing those last night, and they were taking a long time. They were really slow. And the resawing makes a lot of dust. The sound of the saw was really kind of dull. It was more of a growl than kind of that shush shush kind of slicing sound that you get of a sharp saw. And I was having to push a little bit more. It was also stuttering, creating more vibration. And there were a couple of times where I was in mid-stroke and it would kind of catch on me. That's an indication that the saw is getting dull. You saw how easy that saw was running, and more importantly, how easy it was to start. Very little effort. That's a sign of a sharp saw. If it starts to get difficult to start, it's time to resharpen it. I waited too long to resharpen that 48-inch blade, and I'll be honest, sharpening 48-inch blade, it's just one of those things. Everything shuts down. Dedicate 20 minutes to it. I put it off more than I probably should have. So yeah, look for, I shouldn't say don't look for anything. Feel for it to start harder and listen for the pitch of the saw to get deeper. I'm a music major, so I'm a very oral person. I'm constantly hearing my saws and listening to my saws, and they get deeper growly because there's a lot more vibration because the saw's having to work harder and it's vibrating a lot more. You also find that the saw actually feels hotter because it's working a lot harder. One thing I want to add to this, because this is what I do around here. I do have this lesson that I just released today. I originally filmed it years ago when I first built this saw, but I pulled it out of the Hand Tool School Semester 4 curriculum, and I'm now offering this lesson standalone. Well, technically it's 3 videos. There's an actual lesson on resawing, goes in a little bit more depth than what I just showed. I talk about resawing veneer and how the techniques change, not dramatically, but just a little bit to allow you to cut thinner veneer. And I actually build the 36-inch saw. I have the 48-inch saw already built, but it's actually the same construction. And I show you how to actually make your own blade, cut your own teeth. I show you how to sharpen it, how to tune it, set it, and get it running nice and true. That's all in those 3 videos, about 3 hours worth of stuff in there. So it's a very comprehensive lesson, I think, on resawing. So it is available. I'll include a link in the bottom of this post, but it's at handtoolschool.net/product/resawing. So that's it, guys. What other questions do you have? By the way, this is a piece of 1/8-inch curly walnut veneer that was resawn using the 36-inch frame saw. It's out of a big block. This is a good example of wood that I am trying to stretch out as long as I can. See if I can get some raking light on this. It's beautiful, beautiful, curly, almost fiddleback curl walnut. Great color and character in this. If you look at the edge here, you can really see that curl. Gorgeous stuff, gorgeous stuff. This is a great example where I'm just slowly but surely slicing off little pieces of it and using it from time to time. When first learning, what width and length would you recommend? Again, no difference. I would go with the 48-inch saw with a 4-inch wide blade. I just feel, and the only caveat to that would be, like I said, if you went with the 36-inch blade, make the frame saw wider. Make it nearly as make it as wide as your shoulder breadth, if not a little bit wider, because you get a lot more control over it. But again, every time I switched over to that 36-inch saw, it just feels dinky. It feels inefficient, especially in a 8-inch wide board. If you're going to be sawing narrower stuff, I suppose it wouldn't feel quite the same. But it just, to me, it just feels like a wasted saw stroke to sacrifice 12 inches of teeth that could be cutting. I don't know. I just feel like go with a 4-inch wide blade, 48-inch long blade. You'll be so much happier. The only thing would be is it just takes up more room. You know, I've got it hanging on my lumber rack, but it's not, I actually find it easier to use than the 36-inch. The extra length, the extra weight. I mean, I'm a big guy, but I don't think that really makes that big of a difference. If I were 5 feet tall or 6'4", I don't know, I could be wrong. If there are any 5 foot tall or 5'5" type people out there, you tell me if it would be that much harder. But I'm not holding up the saw. The saw is resting on the wood, so it's not a weight issue. In fact, the more weight, I think, the better it cuts. So, yeah. Can I make a saw sing like Roy? Sometimes. Where'd my saws go? I've tried. I'm not nearly as good at it as Roy. He's got the technique down here. So you hold it by the toe. See, I can't make it sustain like he does. I don't know. I guess maybe he's hitting it harder. Anyway, that'll be another live session. Sing along with Shannon and the singing saws. Next time I see Roy, I'll ask him to come up. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. He says, what size practice boards? That's a great question. I actually talked about this in that hand tool school lesson. Go buy 2x construction lumber. Don't waste money on this because, first of all, you're going to have a lot of fun with it. You're going to be slicing stuff up left and right. And you will make mistakes at first. There is a bit of a learning curve. Getting that focus on, and Mike, I know in your particular instance, you might actually do better because it's going to be a lot about listening and a lot about feeling. There's not as much as I'm focused on my lines and paying attention to my lines, a lot of it is feeling the resistance of the saw and really listening to the sound of the saw. But inevitably, you will find that problems occur and you're going to screw up some boards. So don't spend a lot of money on material. Just go buy, I would say 2x6 would be a good width to start with. So construction lumber, you're talking 5.5 inches. Get some 2x6s, maybe get a 2x8, just get an 8 foot of each. Cross cut them into 24-inch lengths or whatever, and just mess around with it. Start by bisecting the boards, and then bisect the bisections. So now you're quartering it and really play around with it. There's no reason to go out and grab a 12-inch wide board or 10-inch wide board because it is a lot more work to cut something that wide. The 9-inch board cut relatively cleanly, but man, you get a 4-inch board and it slices through it like a knife through hot butter. So. Do I have any resources for resawing with a handsaw? Other than what you just saw tonight, I've got a lesson in the hand tool school where I show you how to resaw with a handsaw, but I also showed you the technique that exists. If you didn't see that part at the beginning, just when this goes into rewind mode, you can go back to the beginning and watch it there. I did a joinery bench video where I showed kind of the features of my joinery bench, and I resawed a 9-inch wide cherry panel in that, and I talked about some techniques in there. So if you look in my channel for the joinery bench video, you'll see a little bit of a technique there. Really, it's no different than making a regular rip cut. I do find that having it up around shoulder height makes things a little bit easier because I can come at it from underneath and saw at more of an angle. Yeah. The technique there is just hang on because there's a lot more work. You're using one hand, it just ends up tiring you out. So it's not really a whole lot of different technique there. So cool. Any other questions before I call it a night, guys? I haven't scrolled back up, but see if I missed any other questions. Oh, Kirby, sorry I missed your question. You want, Kirby's saying, you want every tooth of your saw to exit the kerf in the board at least once in either the push or pull. Ideally, yes. Certainly when you get into super wide stuff, that is near impossible. Obviously, if you've got a 32-inch wide board and a 48-inch blade, that only allows for, 6 inches on either side there, and it's just not possible. And it becomes very inefficient very quickly. Now, the coarse teeth means really, really big, deep gullets as I trip over 16-quarter basswood. Whew, that's a freshly sharpened saw. Yikes. Really deep gullets can hold a lot of sawdust. So that means, you know, if these teeth aren't exiting, they're still packing it up, but every now and then you're going to want to pull the saw out and clear that out. You'd be better off, and that's when you look at your limitations. I find that a 28-inch wide board is really the optimal, not optimal, really the suggested maximum for the 48-inch blade. Gives you a good 12 inches of space on either side. Pulling it out will give you another 12 inches, hitting the midpoint of the blade and freeing that. The other side will hit the midpoint and free that. So you think of it as you really want to only saw a board that's as wide as half the length of the blade. So a 36-inch saw blade still will give you a good 18-inch wide width. The reality is it's a little bit less than that because you lose a little bit of the saw blade inside the actual hardware housing. So you're probably losing another, you know, inch to 2 on each end, another 4 inches there. So you're reducing your cut down to maybe 14 inches for the 36-inch saw and like 20, 22 inches for the 48-inch saw, which is even more reason why I think going with a 48-inch saw to maximize as much as you can. Cool. I'm glad I moved back up because that is an important question. Thanks for asking that, Kirby. All right, guys. Good stuff. You all have a lovely evening because I'm going to call it a night.